of it. This subject is of particular interest to me because years ago I had to do a CD-ROM in the days of CD-ROMs, and in this CD-ROM we had the dependent origination, which is usually represented as these 12 terms, which we'll go through shortly. And usually this is represented in a wheel. And I don't know if we can call the wheel up. You might be able to see it. You should. Ignore my political articles that I'm reading here. Should be a bigger one. It's a nice one. I don't know why it came out as a thumbnail. But this is the usual image. Little blurry, but you can see the gist. As you go around from the top clockwise, there are actually 12 compartments around the outer circle. And each of these compartments has a different picture in it, which are fairly standardized. And each one of these compartments with its picture represents one of these 12 terms here in this teaching. And this is called the Wheel of Becoming. And it represents samsara, which is the universe, the world that we live in. Inside is a different breakdown. What we're interested in is the 12 links that go around the outside. So on this CD-ROM project that I was involved in, what he did was, the guy I was working with is a documentary maker, multimedia guy. And so he likes to present visual images. And we were trying to visualize Dharma, which is not that easy. We'd done one CD on the life of the Buddha from when he was, just before he was born to when he got enlightened. That's easy. We have millions of images. And from enlightenment to death, we had millions of images. But Dharma, like 5 khandhas, 6 senses, it's not so many images. So he'd found an image of this, and what he did was he made it 3-dimensional. And when you click on each one of these links around the outer rim, the thing would turn into 3 dimensions and you would fly in to that particular link. And in that link would have a room, and on each wall of the room would have a different presentation of it. It's really quite good. I'll bring it for you next year. I'm quite proud of the work that we did on these whole CD-ROMs. It's very, very beautiful. I'm very proud of actually he became my closest friend for quite a long time. And what happened was it was funded by a royal foundation in Bangkok. And after they completed this production, they just sat on it and never let anybody see it. So it's still there. One day I'm going to put the whole thing online. But I can't really do it because I signed forms saying that I wouldn't give away the images, and there's copyright issues, which we do have to take seriously. But there's all these videos that we made, these little clips and beautiful descriptions of Dharma, and you can get a copy, but they're on CDs, which nobody uses now. And you'd have to go and find the office. Good luck finding it open. Because this is like a royal foundation. They turn up for work maybe once a month, have lunch and go home. I mean, good luck finding them. And it costs 40,000 baht, which is $1,800 Sing dollars. and they don't take credit cards. So as we were doing this wheel, all the way through the CDs, I had to find the particular suttas that related to that event in the Buddha's life. So when the Buddha was born, for example, you can click on the link and then you jump to Lumpini and you get a three-dimensional visual map of Lumpini that you can fly through. And then there will be a sutta link that we would give the actual sutta of where it describes this event. And so the whole thing was quite majestic. It took 4 years of a lot of hard work, multi-million-dollar project. When we came to do this link, of course, he loved this, being an audio-visual guy, flying into these rooms and flying through the whole process of how the universe arises and ceases. But I have to write the descriptions. And I know what I think it means. But this is probably one of the most debated teachings in the whole of Buddhism. Those of you who know dependent origination know there are as many different forms as there are teachers who teach it. And part of the reason for that is the Buddha did not give good, clear definitions of the terms. And where he does give definitions, they're not consistent. So the Pali scriptures are pretty good. They're fairly consistent. The gist of them is very consistent. But the actual definitions, term by term, of different things, this more difficult. So there are a lot of interpretations of it. I had my interpretation, but I wasn't confident to put my interpretation into this CD-ROM funded by the Royal Foundation that would be there for all eternity. I didn't know at that time it was going to be locked in an office, inaccessible for all eternity, but the director of the project, my good friend, Titus Leber, he sold this whole project to Sony, and Sony would do worldwide distribution and wanted to put it in every library in the world. And Sony would get 60% and the foundation would get 40%. Right? But 40% of that is millions and millions of dollars. And they said, no, we own the pictures. So nobody's ever seen it. That's what happens when you have Royal Foundation sponsoring things. It should have been done in Singapore. I think you guys would have been much more organized.
Before you will get sent out, even before it's finished.
Yes. And you'll know how to make money out of it too. I mean, it cost millions to make the whole project. So I'll bring it for you next year because I do have permission to show it. I just don't have permission to copy it. So I had to put, in this particular thing, I had to put the definitions of what all these terms meant. And I wasn't quite confident enough to give my definition. So I went to the suttas directly. And I found out for each of these different links exactly what does the sutta say, what definitions does it give for each term. And what I found was something that's very different to the way that it's normally taught. And being later on from that, I actually did my degree. And then while I was doing my degree in psychology, I fell in love with a particular old German school of psychology called Gestalt. This is not Gestalt therapy. I've studied psychology. I'm not a therapist. So just in case you want to tell me your problems, like... There's a great video. Have you seen the Bob Newhart? He has a video called Stop It. You haven't seen this? I don't know if we should show it. It's a bit risky, but Gestalt Perception was a school of psychology in the started around 1911 and ended about 1935 with the Nazis. Most of the psychologists engaged in this particular school were Jewish, and so in the 1930s in Germany, of course, they had to leave Germany or get put in concentration camps. And so the Gestalt psychologists spread out to America and England and Norway, and so the school kind of died. But I fell in love with this particular school of psychology, or school of perception. And this was, what I saw was this, what we find in Gestalt is exactly what's described in this process, independent origination. Gestalt doesn't go as far because they have no idea about enlightenment. So we won't find any teachings of enlightenment in this psychological school. But it really makes it quite clear exactly what this process is. It gives an overview for the process, and then you can contextualize each link. You know, there's two ways of investigating something. One is to go into the details to try and understand the big picture. The other is to go into the big picture, which contextualizes the details. So what I'm proposing here is more, we're going to look at the big picture to show what the details mean, what it might mean. I think this was called Phenomenology, right? I call this. I'm going to, in case there's any real philosophers here, I'm not a real philosopher. And so when I read the title that I gave you like months ago, I'm like, oh no. Like, I'm not an expert on phenomenology, and I'm not an expert on philosophy, so I'm really, really hoping there's no philosophers here that you're going to pull me to pieces on this. What happened was, in the... It should be on the... Okay. In the early days of psychology, before psychology had really come about, I think psychology was really born with Freud. One might argue with that, but... So before Freud, Wilhelm Wundt, and William James had this idea that when we investigate how the mind works, how the psyche works, I like to do it this way. When I teach psychology in my class, we have something like this. So something like this. You and I are both in the world, and we can experience the world in roughly the same way. We go outside, we see the same trees, we are affected by the same weather, we have a human body, we have senses. There may be some differences, like I'm English, so I might see some different things. But pretty much we can agree on roughly the environment that we're in. We perceive this environment through our senses. In Buddhism, there are 6 senses. In psychology, often there are 5, but I think there's about 14 total. It depends how you want to categorize it. We have a vestibular sense that knows when you're spinning around. We have another sense in the ear that knows up from down. You don't realize that you know that, but actually you sense that all the time. So there are a number of senses. There's the somatosensory, is the sense that knows where your body is in relation to itself, like a body map. So if I close your eye, try this, close your eyes and then put your finger on your nose. Can you do that now? Anybody miss their nose? Anyone poke yourself in the eye? So this is actually a separate sense. It's not the normal sense of heat, your fingers and skin. No, heat, cold, and pressure. But this sense is a different sense. It knows where your body is in relation to itself. And there's a few people who have been born without this sense. So if they look while they're walking, they don't know where their feet are and they fall over. So it's quite a handicap, but usually the people who have this, who are very few, they learn to be extremely mindful because they have to know exactly where their feet and hands are at any one moment. And to walk, they have to keep an eye on their feet because they can visually know where their feet are. But if they want to look around, they have to hold on to something, and then they can look around, and they don't fall over because they can mindfully feel it with their hands. So there are actually quite a lot of different senses. For most of us, this is going to be fairly similar, but this is going to be different. For example, right now everybody looks at the political parties in Thailand and see there's this guy leads this party, that guy leads that party, this woman leads that party. And so we're all agreeing on what we can see, but what we do is totally different. People say, this guy, that military, they should rule Thailand so much better. And then the other people say, no, the Democrats are much better. Why is our behavior different? When I teach this in Bangkok, I always point out the students. Some students sit at the back of the class, and some students sit at the front of the class. And I have done a number of times when I teach them how to do surveys. My favorite survey is the grade point average of the people that sit at the front compared to the grade point average of you guys at the back. So, and actually it does vary. Why do some people come on time and some people are always late? Why do I watch the boxing and I'm like, wow, this is great, and you think this is terrible violence? So why is our behavior different is the big question in psychology. So if we agree on this, the question is, in here there's a black box, and this is called the psyche. So the idea is we want to draw a model that goes in here that explains why behavior is different for different people. And that's what psychology is. It's what we're trying to do. It's not said that this is actually real. This is a theoretical model, right? So like Freud, for example, had his iceberg. He said you have your unconscious mind, your pre-conscious mind, and then your conscious mind. This is quite important for our dependent origination. But this is a model that Freud came up with. Modern psychologists tend to dismiss this model and tend to disagree with it. The question is, how good does your model explain behavior? That's what psychology is. So at that time, there was a debate that when you are investigating psychology, do you observe the behavior from the outside and see what people are doing and try to figure out from the behavior a model to fit the psyche? Or do you ask people to report from the inside what they are feeling and what they are thinking? So I presume most of you were here today. Earlier on, I gave this example of some people going for an interview, and depending on the weight of the... Was everyone here today, this afternoon? Anybody not here this morning? Oh, okay, just start again. The question was, a lot of our behavior comes from things that we don't understand. We don't know why we choose certain things. So I gave an example of reading a story. If you have a short funny story, and you split a group into two groups, and you read the story and mark from 1 to 10 how funny you think the story is. But one group holds a pen in their teeth, and one whole group holds the pen in their mouth. Turns out the group that hold the pen in the teeth will find the story more funny than the group that holds the pen in the lips. And the reason is in the body language. If you hold a pen in your teeth, you're kind of looking happy. You hold a pen in your mouth, you're looking grumpy. So there's a biofeedback. But the point is that if you ask people, nobody would know that they are being influenced by something from the outside. So psychologists research this a lot. We were really interested in this topic. There's hundreds and hundreds of different examples and tests that show you really don't know, you really can't explain your behavior as well as you think you can. So the early psychologists were debating this. Do you just ask people, why did you do this? Why do you come to the front of the class? Freud was asking this question too in his early days. This was a big question in psychology. I should step back a little bit. So one way of investigating psychology was to watch behavior. And so this is when psychologists did a lot of work on animals, on rats and mice and cats. And so the first thing you learn when you learn psychology is you learn Pavlov and his dogs, right? Pavlov was actually investigating the salivatory glands of the dog, not psychology. He wasn't a psychologist. So he fed a pipe into the gland and would see how much saliva the dog would produce when he gives the dog food. And what he found was the dog would produce saliva even when it thought it was going to get food, the expectation. So this is how we can investigate psychology in animals, by observation. The other way was William James, the more American way, and he said that to understand the mind, you have to ask people, why did you do this? Why did you do that? The trouble is you don't know really why you do things. And the trouble with watching animals is they're just animals, they're not human beings. So we can't do these experiments on human beings, unfortunately. Freud was investigating this exact same question, and the story goes that he went to see a very famous mesmerist, or what we now call a hypnotist, in France. And the hypnotist had called people onto the stage, hypnotized them, and he told one woman, when the clock strikes 2, go and open a window. And then he goes on to the other people and, pretend that you're an apple and blah, 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 the usual kind of shows. And then the subjects went and sat down. And then the clock struck 2, and the woman got up, and she went over and she opened the window. Did I say open or close a minute ago? Open. She got up and she went over and she opened the window. Now, this is because she'd been programmed to do it by the hypnotist, right? Then the hypnotist asked her, why did you open the window? And she said, I opened the window because I was a bit hot, it's a bit stuffy. And this is what caught Freud's attention. He said that you might do things and not know why you're doing them. Your motivations for doing things come from here, come from the unconscious. And if the therapist is going to explain your behavior, they can't ask you. They have to find some way to get into your unconscious, to find the things in your unconscious. Then they can find your motivations. I should say that for most of psychology, tends to reject this theory now. Cognitive behavioral therapy, for example, works up here, works on habits and the way that you think about things rather than this big unconscious. But that was Freudianism. So at this time, while there was this debate, there was a psychologist slash philosopher slash very strange Italian man who came up with some funny ideas. And this is the most famous philosopher you will never have heard of. Franz Brentano was his name. And his influence is vast. So I mean it when I say he's the most famous philosopher you've never heard of. His approach had such a huge influence on the world that it's amazing that nobody's ever heard of him. I love people like this because then I'm kind of one up on everybody else, you know. And Brentano's main contribution was that you need to ask people their experience rather than what they think about their experience. So his methodology was to try and get people to report actually what they experience. Much later on, there was an example of this. Somebody said that they died in an operation or just before an operation, and they'd had this vision, and an angel had come down and had said to them, blah, 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 you have to do this, no, you have to go back into your body. And it was interviewed by someone in the Brentano school, and what they'd actually experienced was blue. And that's different to an angel coming down. An angel coming down was what they thought about their experience. So Brentano wants to get to what is your actual experience that you do experience, and cut aside all of your thoughts about it. So this was a very different methodology to the two methodologies that I just explained, right? One is your reporting, and the other is your behavior. Brentano wants to know, what do you actually experience? Brentano taught Freud. He taught Edmund Husserl. I don't know, I never know how you say his name. Husserl, who was the philosopher who started phenomenology. And phenomenology, the word phenomenology means what is actually experienced. So Husserl became hugely, I mean, there is a whole school of psychology, of philosophy now called phenomenology. Between you and me, I wouldn't recommend it. I'm not great on philosophy anyway. And boy, Husserl's stuff gets really, really complicated. I mean, his project was huge. And then later phenomenologists disagreed with him, so you get into this whole like stage one phenomenology, later phenomenology, modern phenomenology, retroactive, oh God, it's awful. So if you're interested, like just a simple foundation book on phenomenology, that's what I would recommend. Shall I write, if you need me to write these words down at all, maybe I can do that. And do feel, sorry, I'll get into trouble. Do feel free to stop, interrupt, ask question. You'll get much more out of it if you do that.
Can I just ask a question? When you talk about the unconscious mind, that most of us determine how we behave, does this mean it's the mind that is not mindful?
No. She's asking, does the unconscious mean the mind that isn't mindful? No. Let me just write this word down. Phenomenology was the school that his student, Edmund Husserl, invented, and this is the school of psychology, of philosophy. Okay, the question, does this mean not being mindful? No, this is your... Do you know what the word gravity means? Right? How do you know what the word gravity means? What day of the week did you learn it? Was it on a Monday or a Tuesday or a Wednesday? Who was it who told you? Primary school teacher? Are you sure that that person taught you gravity? Exactly what age were you? Where were you sitting in the room when you were told the word gravity? Okay, so you have no idea really how or where you learned the word gravity, but you know what it is. So this means there are things in your past that you can't remember, you can't explain, you can't contextualize, but have an effect on the present moment. That is, you do know what the word gravity means. And if you're in any doubt, you go to Google, and Google will tell you. Ajahn Google. It's a bit of an aside, but Freud, when he was first starting to form these ideas, he had a patient, and she was called a hysteric patient, and hysteric means like deluded, heavily deluded kind of patient, or not with a good grip on reality. And one of her problems was she could not drink water. She had a distaste and a disgust of going anywhere near water. And this is a problem. This is one of her many, 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 many problems that she had. And these were physical symptoms very often, like coughing, that didn't have a physical basis. So, and Freud was originally training as a doctor, right? He wasn't training as a psychologist. So he had this patient in his room, and he would kind of calm her down, get her in and get her talking. And she said, I like coming to see you and talking to you. And she called it talking therapy. And Freud could see that some of her symptoms would reduce just by coming and talking to him, even though he'd done nothing as a doctor to solve the problem. This is where he started to get the idea of therapy, right? As she's talking, she says, you know what, I remember when I was 6 years old, there was a glass of water on the table, and the dog came and licked the water out of the glass and left, and then my mum came in and drank it. Oh, it was disgusting. So Freud said, he goes and gets a glass of water and he gives it to her, and she drinks the water. The act of remembering where this behavior had come from was she was able then to unwind that behavior. And this is what is called catharsis in psychology. So Freud's idea came from that real one event, was that your behavior, whether you're diligent or lazy, whether you like sport or you like reading books, whether you are an angry person or a gentle person, all comes from stuff you can't remember, but still has an effect on you, and that's the unconscious. So Freudian therapy is to try and dig into your unconscious. So you use dream therapy, for example, because your dreams will express things from here. Word association, hypnosis, etc. Again, I'm going to repeat, many, if not most, psychologists now reject this theory. So there are different schools of thought. So Franz Brentano wanted to get to what do people actually experience, not what they think about their experience, not their explanations and things like that. So he taught Freud. Freud got a lot of ideas from him. He taught Edmund Husserl, who started Phenomenology. He taught William James, who went over to the States and wrote some of the greatest early psychological texts. Very difficult to read, in my opinion, but he taught a guy called Max Wertheimer. Max Wertheimer. And Max Wertheimer started the school of psychology called Gestalt. So, when I call this dependent origination and phenomenology, I'm not an expert in this. This is my field of expertise, Gestalt, but comes from the same guy. Now, what Wertheimer and others did was they want to see exactly what you're experiencing. And what they found was, out of everything, all of your senses that bring in information from here, what happens is the psyche will organize everything. This is your senses, You also have your memory. This board is going to get way more messy. You have your memory, you have your history, you have what your parents told you, you have your culture. All of these different things will all be piling into here. And what the psyche will do then is present this word present is quite important. They will present a figure on ground. Figure on ground. And this is important because figure on ground is, what I'm going to claim anyway, is this bit here. So independent origination. The reason I want to go here first, before looking at the Buddhist teaching, is because this will give the whole picture. Remember, you can go from the details to the full understanding, or you can go from the whole picture to understanding the details. So we want to get the whole picture and the general idea first, then see if it makes any sense over here. I will explain some of these terms. Actually, today we're really only interested in these two, but I will recap these two, which was what we did a couple of days ago. Okay, figure on ground. What does this mean? If you look at the Buddha image behind me, I prefer this microphone for some reason. At the moment when you look at this Buddha image, can you see the color of the cupboards? Can you see both together? Can you see the Buddha image and the color of the cupboards? Yeah? Can you feel the feelings in your big toe? Can you feel the feelings in your big toe and the Buddha image at the same time? Yes? He's saying yes. Seems. Okay, try this one. The feeling in your big toe, the Buddha image, and the sound of the air conditioning. Right, you can't do it. When you try to hold two things in the mind at once, what will happen is, for a moment, it'll seem like you can do it. But then if you watch, what will happen is the mind will switch. You can't hold two things in the mind at one time. And this is the actual experience from the psyche presents a certain experience to you. So you look at the Buddha image, you see the Buddha image. That is one object. Even though it's comprised of many parts, it's one object that's presented to you. And the word Gestalt means a whole. So things... Try looking at the Buddha image while the phone goes, right? Your attention immediately, and when your attention goes there, it's not here, right? So a Gestalt means that a whole will be presented to you, even if that whole is comprised of many different parts, right? So the Buddha image has many parts, has the let's see what it's got. Okay, it's got the hair with the little curls that should curl around to the right. It has this style of robes on it. And the reason this style of robes was done on Buddha images was the materials that they were making the Buddha image out of, I think it's called lignite, was a very rough kind of rock. And you can't put details into it. So they made this kind of very flat robes. Compared to the Indian Buddha images, which have these every fold in the robe is presented. It's down to the material they were using. So what happens is the Buddha image can appear as a whole, but you can also break it down. Instead of that being the whole, you can look at the robes. But while you're looking at the robes, you're not seeing the whole. Or you can stop that object and look at the hairs on the head. Or you can abandon the hairs on the head of the Buddha image and look at the flower. If I'm telling you to look at the Buddha image and asking you questions about it, and then make you close your eyes and say, what color is the flower? Most of you will not be able to say what color the flower was. And the only ones of you who could are the ones who specifically noted it. Your attention would have to turn it and make that into an object. Otherwise, you won't know what color the flower was. Okay, everybody close your eyes. No peeking. No peeking. The flower on my left, on the other side, what is positioned in front of the flower pot? Anybody know? Keep your eyes closed. You've opened your eyes. Keep your eyes closed. Do you know? Okay, open your eyes. You've got the tissues here. Okay, you probably couldn't see, but you guys should know. But that's the thing, you don't notice it. You think that you have seen this whole picture. You can be sat here for 3 hours and you would not know about that tissue box. You think that you have a vivid experience of the world. You don't. You're only having an experience of certain things presenting to your consciousness. So this is what Gestalt means. Gestalt is a whole. This table, for example, has 4 legs. You could argue it has 2 legs, but it has 4 legs. It has a top. It also has a certain size to it. I mean, if this was the size of the building, you wouldn't think of it as a table. It also has a quality of being level. If the table's like this, you wouldn't really think of it as a table. So there is a certain size and a function. There are different parts to it. But what do you see all these parts and functions and things? No. What do you see? Table. Even though it's comprised of many parts, these parts are organized into a whole. And that's what a Gestalt is. It means that from moment to moment, your consciousness is bringing together wholes and presenting them to you. And whatever is outside of that whole gets relegated to the background and you don't really notice it consciously. You may notice it unconsciously, but it's another question. Is that clear enough? Okay. The Gestalt that's organized into a whole, which is what you see, one whole at a time, whole W-H-O-L-E, right? One whole at a time. There are many qualities to it, and this is what Gestalt does. It investigates why do certain things organize into wholes. It obviously can't go too far into Gestalt today, but the important thing is that the wholes come complete. The wholes come complete with both the physical and mental factors, and you can't separate them. Nothing appears just as purely physical. When you look at the tissue box, you can't see it just as a visual form. You will also see what tissues are, what they're used for. It comes complete with your memory, with your associations, whether you like it or you dislike it, right? It has to come complete with both physical and mental factors, right? Okay. So I've got a few examples for you. Here's my favorite example. We have the video. What happened? We lost it. HDMI. Okay, it should come in as did come up.
No, yours is a little bit. Nothing that came out. Just now this one came out. That one came out.
There, okay. So, do you know this cat? Some of you will know this cat, probably the most famous cat in the world, other than maybe Tom and Jerry or Sylvester. And his name is Grumpy Cat. And you might think this is photoshopped, but it's not. This actually is how the cat's face looks, right? And they're even making a movie about him now. He's getting his own movie. There are a lot of memes. Whenever you write something that you disagree with, you always put his grumpy cat's face on it. So when you look at that face, your intelligence knows that the cat isn't grumpy, right? You've got the sense to know that actually that's just the way the cat's face looks, right? But you can't separate it, can you? And this is what's happening. This is what Gestalt means, is that certain things will come together and form a whole. And the whole comes complete with the physical and the mental aspects. So you see the physical picture of it, but you've also got the mental aspect of, he looks very unhappy. He looks like it's bath day for cats, right? And you can't get away from it. So this is what a Gestalt is. It means that the physical and the mental aspect, whether it's a sound or a feeling or anything, will always get organized and presented to you. And what you as a human being are aware of is only the presentations. Now, while you're looking at the grumpy cat, you're not noticing what's in the cupboard next to it, because grumpy cat is forming your Gestalt, the figure. Everything else is the background, or what we call ground, not background, but technical term. I'm sure I have some more examples. Okay, here's another one. Now you know that's just 2 carrots, right? You know that. Your intelligence knows that. But you can't see it any other way than 2 carrots having a hug, right? There's no way around that experience. Here's another one. This is called a Vexia photo, Vexia picture. And so I presume all of you can see the face, right? Human beings are in the organization by evolution or whatever. We have this predilection or bias to certain things. So we are biased towards arranging something into a face. Faces are extremely important to human beings, so we recognize them very easily, even when you do that. A colon and a bracket, well, it's a parentheses, but I call it a bracket. Even that becomes a face, right? It's getting organized into a face for you. People that have a deficiency in this is called face blindness. And they can't recognize a face, even of their wife or children. The most famous example of this was Oliver Sacks, who wrote the book, The Man Who Mistook, you know this book? The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. You know, anybody read that book? Nobody read that book? You have, okay. It's a very famous book. Oliver Sacks had face blindness. He cannot tell who he's talking to. Even if he's talking to you, turns around and comes back, he doesn't know who he was talking to because he can't recognize faces. This system of organizing things into a face doesn't work for him. He can recognize your voice. So people who know him would always immediately, even if he turned around and then turned back, they would use their voice. and you'd recognize the voice immediately. So we have this organization will bias us towards faces. Now, here's an interesting way to see gestalts. You look at this as a face, right? If you're at an angle, it's going to be harder. If you're face on, it's going to be easier. But try and look at it as birds in a tree. Can you do that? Yes. Which one is stronger, the face or the birds on the tree? Face. While you're seeing the birds on the tree, can you see the face? Are you sure? Isn't your actual, remember Franz Brentano, he wants to know what's actually going on, not what you think. When you actually look at it, can you see both the face and the birds, or are you seeing one or the other? For most people, you can switch around. So in that sense, you can see both. But you can't see both at the same time because of this organization that goes on behind your conscious awareness. The only thing you will ever be conscious of in your entire existence, unless you get enlightened, is the presentation that comes after the organization.
So are we always drawn to the whole thing first?
Yes, we're always drawn to wholes. Things will always organize into wholes first, unless there is a weak, what we call a weak gestalt, or weak pragans, weak organization. And this is those times when you look at something and you're like, what's that? And you tilt your head a couple of times, and then you get it. You can see what it is. By the way, when you look at clouds and you see a boat or a face or a horsey or something, this is what's happening, is you're looking at something weak, but your organization is desperately trying to fit it into something that it's going to be familiar with. So this is why you see a ship when it's really nothing like a ship. This is why you see ghosts, right? Because you have weak input. It's dark, there's a lot of shadows around, and you just have this natural tendency, you want to organize things into people or animals. Faces are stronger than people are stronger than animals stronger than objects. So when you look around in a dark room or a dark forest, your mind's desperately trying to make faces out of it. That's why you see ghosts. Yes. When what? When you read something. I'm not sure reading. Listening to music is the better example because you don't hear note by note by note by note. You hear a melody. So, I'm going to prove this. You can all hear that? Okay. I'm going to tap out a song, a tune. And you have to guess what the tune is. Sorry. You have to guess what the tune is when I tap the tune out. Right? If you know what it is, don't say anything. And when I finish tapping it out, raise your hand if you know what the tune is. Right? Then I'm going to tell you what the tune is, and I'm going to tap it out again. And you see the difference in the organization of how it's presented. It'll be the exact same tapping. But once your mind has found a way to organize it, it's then impossible to get away from. Just like once you see the face, you can't really stop seeing the face. You all ready? Yes. Remember, don't shout out if you know what it is, but you will put your hand up if you do. Yeah, that could be any tune. Okay, raise your hand if you know what it is. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, what is it? What is the tune? Jingle bells, right? So listen again. Totally different. Now, just the tapping is a weak gestalt. But once the mind has found a way to organize, snap, that becomes your object. So gestalt actually can pass through time also. It's not just a picture, can operate through any sense. I'm not sure when you're reading a book whether you have a gestalt of the whole book. That you have Gestalt Actions, and an action will organize things. So, for example, if I ask you, I'm not going to, but if I asked you to walk to this side of the room, you would automatically be moving in between the people. But if then I asked you, how many people did you move in between? How many times did you step left? You've got no recollection, because the Gestalt action was organizing the whole event for you. Okay, I really need to get on to dependent origination. This is one of also my favorites. So this is a well-known illusion. There are what appears as to be two blocks, right, on the top and the bottom. Which one is darker? Yeah, but you're using your brain, you use your eye.
Eyes is the top.
So this looks darker than this, right?
Yes.
If you do on a computer, it's easier, but I'm going to try and do it for you.
Yeah, if you close the cover, yes.
I can do it. Now, what happens in your experience between these two colors? Watch the organizational change before your very eyes. You should see them start to become the same color.
Move a bit.
And if I move it away, you'll see it start to change color again.
With a bit of white and
It's a bit
grey.
difficult because you can actually see the lines here. So if you do it on a computer and put your finger across, you'll actually see this suddenly turn darker and this one turn lighter.
You can actually do it.
Yeah, do it with your finger. So this is the organization. Your mind is organized
With
to
your
see
tongue.
three-dimensional objects. This is two-dimensional, but you will see three-dimensional objects and the shading within them. The most famous example of this is called the Necker cube. Unfortunately, your projector is not showing the right aspect ratio. If you see on the computer, it's exactly square. And what will happen is your mind will organize it one way, and then it will snap, and you'll suddenly see the cube in the other way. It's a bit tricky here because the aspect ratio is being changed. There's actually another example. This is the most famous one. So which side is the front and which side is the back?
So now it's like the flat arm is the front, and then you see.
But I guarantee what you do not see is a series of straight lines on a flat surface. Right? That you can't see because it's organized before you are aware of it and given for a presentation. And a really nice example of that one is this one here. So this here, is this a pyramid or is this a hole? Well, you saw it as a hole. It took me ages to see the hole. I only saw a pyramid. It took me a long time. I was like, a hole? Oh, that's not a hole. That's a... Okay. But the point is, you'll notice that the organization will happen, and you can't see what's actually there. You only see what's presented. And your mind is predisposed to present three-dimensional objects because you move around in the world in 3 dimensions. So even though that's a flat surface and just a picture, your mind will automatically organize it into a 3-dimensional object because that's most likely what it would be in the world. You encounter more 3D objects than you do 2D objects. Any more? Oh, there's a good one. Looking from the side, it's quite clear, but when you look head on, it starts to really...
Oh, mix all over.
Looks like it's moving almost. Yeah. So what do you think? Right, but the point is that you cannot look at that and not think it's laughing. Right? That just will get organized and presented to you. You know in your intelligence that that is not laughing. It's just opening its mouth. But things come organized and presented to you as a whole. By the way, if I turn it off, what was the background of that animal? What color? What was there? Gray. Was it on grass? Was it on rocks? Was it on sand? Was it on water? You just looked at that image. You just examined it consciously, specifically, and you don't know what the background was, right? Let's see again, right? So it's kind of brown, rocky lava kind of thing. But that's what happens. You will see the object that's presented to you. Everything else gets relegated as background. And the ground you won't notice, consciously notice. It does actually, the background still goes into the senses, still gets organized. So something happened in the background, like a spider started to move. You're still seeing it, but what will happen, that gets organized and then presented to you like, oh, spider. Okay, so we've got the gist, we've got the way that Gestalts work, right? I think everybody can follow that. Yeah, this is one of the most, this is actually my thesis, 19 years in the writing. Yeah, so it's the exact same image shown twice, right? One of the interesting things with the Gestalt, one of the qualities of ground is that ground is perceived to be complete behind the figure. So you assume that ground, actually, you see it as a complete thing. You don't see it as something that's cut out. Whereas here is the opposite. The white seems like the ground, and you presume the white goes on forever. That's the way it's organizes in your mind. Okay, so this process of finding a figure on the ground, organizing figure on the ground. Last one I'm going to show you, I think. Okay, this was Wertheimer's own actual 1911 document. He showed that there is an arrangement of dots, but those dots become arranged into a pattern. You can't look at the dots and not see the pattern of straight lines. Why do you see the straight lines? You see straight lines coming down, right? And repeated. You don't, for example, see straight lines coming down here, right? That also is an equally valid organization, right? But you won't see it. Things will get organized in a certain way and presented to your consciousness.
We see usually across and vertical.
Yeah, human beings will favor horizontals to verticals. The point of this is that things are organized, and then what is presented to consciousness is a figure on the ground. So right just then you saw the walrus. That was presented as the figure, complete with the happy smile. right? Both physical and mental aspects are organized together and presented. Mostly it's based on just the physics of the brain. Learning comes into it, but very weakly. It's very weak. Let me give an example. This is Wertheimer's own example from his 1923 paper. Okay, so what do you see there? This is Wertheimer's own example. How is it organized? Okay. It's organized as a strange thing with kind of two sides and a little diamondy thing in the middle, right? Well, Wertheimer questioned this. He said, why do you organize that way? Isn't there an easier way to see that? A W and an M, right? That's a W and an M. So Wertheimer said that if what you are experiencing depends on what you've learned and what you know and what you think, we should see a W and an M easier than we see a completely abstract weird figure. But that weird figure will organize and present itself more than the W and the M. So Wertheimer said that what you have learned, because this is learned figures, right? What you have learned is not that relevant to the organization. Sorry, you're going to have to switch back now. Okay, so here's one of my own examples. On the left, you'll see two squares, right? That's the more logical thing that gets... But maybe it's not two squares, maybe it's the other two shapes. So all I did was I moved it apart a little bit. And there's two other strange shapes. It's the exact same thing, I just photoshopped it apart slightly. Right? You put these two together and you get that. But the point is that this will naturally organize into nice, complete wholes for you, two squares crossing each other. Yeah, this is the last one I'm going to show you. So, what do you see there? Depends on your angle, actually. If you're looking from the side, you might not see it. Over on this side, presumably you can see the letter E, right? Right. Even though most of it's incomplete. Most of the E is incomplete. If you look very carefully, you will actually have a sense that there's almost a line here. This bit of white is perceived differently to this bit of white. This is very significant because this shows that you're not basing your experience on your senses, because this white and this white is the same. But this bit of white here is experienced differently to this bit of white here. Right? If you look carefully, it's like you can almost see a line there, right? Your mind wants to put that line in for you to make it complete. Okay, it's enough on Gestalt. We've got the picture, the general idea now, that things are organized into a presentation, which is what we call figure, and the figure appears on the ground. What we're really interested in is the figure. Now, the figure comes complete with the mental side and the physical side together, as we've shown. Now we're going to come over to Nama Rupa here. Nama Rupa is translated as name, which really means mental factors, and form, which really means the physical factors. According to the Buddha, name cannot, how do I write easily? Cannot arise without form. And form cannot arise it's a bit clumsy the way that I've written it. I need to find a better way to present. But according to the Buddha then, when we have a presentation of a figure, just like the walrus cannot appear without looking like it's smiling, we always have the mental side and the physical side put together and presented as a gestalt, as a whole. The Buddha said of Nama-rupa, you cannot have anything mental arise without a form to it. And you cannot have any form, cannot arise without a mental side to it. So what the Buddha has said here is this here, Nama-rupa, is a gestalt. Or a gestalt, or you can say a figure that appears on the ground. Okay? So, if we look at dependent origination, some people here not familiar with dependent origination. Mostly I've used the common translations, but there's a couple of them I've changed. Cognition I've changed, object I've changed. This, just for those who are not familiar with dependent origination, when the Buddha would describe things, he would use three main different models. One model is an elemental breakdown. I gave this example a few days ago of a Toyota. Toyotas have 4-cylinder engines of 3 different sizes, a 6-cylinder engine of 2 different sizes, and a diesel engine. So in total, you might have 8 different engines that go in Toyotas. You might have 5 different chassis, a Toyota Yaris, a Toyota Corolla, a Toyota Jeep would be a different chassis. You'd have different wheels, maybe fat wheels, thin wheels, short wheels, alloy wheels. So you might have 30 different kind of wheels. If we break down Toyota by elements, that's what we would get, this big long list of parts. And that's one way to understand Toyota. But you've never seen a Toyota with 12 different engines and 36 different wheels. So another way to think of a Toyota is the threads that stitch them together. So you need 1 engine, 1 chassis, and 4 wheels. Stitch these together, and then it's another way to say you've got the Toyota, how it would actually appear. Another way to think of a Toyota is if a Toyota is driving down the road and you were to freeze time. What would you see? You would have a Toyota, you would have a driver, and you'd have a destination, for example. So that's another way to understand Toyota. So in Indian philosophy, all of these different ways, 4 main different ways, were used to understand things. Dependent origination is understanding by process. Is understanding the process. So the process of a Toyota is, you need a car and you need a driver. Neither of them comes first. You can say it's a driver and a car or a car and a driver. It doesn't matter. Same here. We say name and form, but you could say form and name. They're not in any sequence. So you need a car, you need a driver, you need a destination, and you need petrol, right? So that would be a process then. Get the car and the driver together, put the driver in the car, start the engine, a destination, and that's a process that's going on. So one of the 3 main ways the Buddha would describe the human being and how we suffer is by process. And the process is fairly straightforwardly. These 2 we looked at yesterday. Very often this process of dependent origination does not include the first two. So although there are traditionally there are these 12 links, you should understand, sometimes there's 8 links, sometimes there's 9 links, sometimes there's 24 links, sometimes they're just arranged differently. I have one sutta where this one here, Sankhara, actually appears down here. So things can get swapped around quite a lot. But like I say, if we look at a Toyota, do we say you have a car, a driver, and a destination? We can just as easily say you have a driver, a destination, and a car. It doesn't really matter which order you put them in. So this was activity of body, speech, and mind. So sankhara means, in philosophical terms, this means intentionality. And intentionality means, like this, you can't have one without the other. You cannot have desire and not have something that you're desiring. You cannot hate and not have a thing that you are hating. You cannot taste and not have a thing that you are tasting. Right? So in philosophical terms, this is called intentionality. And what it means is the mind is always, well, not the mind, experience, the figure, the experience. I'd written it down up here somewhere. The experience is always directed at something. You can't just experience without something that you are experiencing, right? That's a philosophical standpoint that Buddhism holds to also, except for nibbana, except for enlightenment. At that time, you might not be experiencing anything, but I don't want to go into that, what it's like to be enlightened, because I don't know. So what sankhara means, and there are many debates, and those of you who know these terms, there are many, many debates about this term here. But what I'm presenting today is sankhara means in its, and I have the quotations to prove it in my dissertation here, action through body, speech, or mind. So it's a movement out. You may imagine the citta, or the mind, just being there, beautiful, pure by itself, and then the mind starts to move out, starts to act in the world. Okay, so that's what we looked at, I don't know, was it yesterday or a few days ago? You've had me doing so many things, I can't remember. So what we're looking at today is these two terms here. So when the mind moves, what happens? The movement of the mind causes some kind of figure to appear on the ground. One thing at a time. One thing after one thing after one thing. The Buddha described it this way: a monkey swinging through the forest, grabs one branch, lets go, grabs another branch, lets go, grabs another branch. He's not describing a busy mind. Some people misunderstand this sutta and they say, oh, my mind's like a monkey because it's jumping around. No, the mind is always doing that. That's the only thing that it can do. You can jump from one, I'm going to use these terms interchangeably, either figure or experience. Your mind jumps from one figure to another figure to another figure. It sees the walrus, or it sees the background to the walrus. It sees the face, or it sees the birds on the tree. It's jumping from one thing to another thing. That's what the Buddha meant when he said, the mind is like the monkey swinging through the forest, grabbing one branch, let go, grab another branch, let go, grab another branch. And what happens when you grab onto that branch, or you get a figure presented to consciousness? What happens is consciousness and the figure go together. This was called, how do we do it? Nama Rupa. And so one of the ways that it was formulated in the sutta is you have the name or the mental side at one end, You have the physical side at the other. It's stitched together by craving, and consciousness arises. Another way that you had it was nama rupa appears at one end, consciousness appears at the other end, and what happens is you have contact. So these are all different, slightly different models that appeared in the suttas. The point is nama rupa and consciousness go together. You can't have nama rupa without consciousness. You won't have consciousness without nama rupa or some kind of figure that you're experiencing. So these two were said to lean on each other like two bushels of grass leaning on each other. If you take away one, the other one falls. So they were said to condition each other. Just like we say a Toyota and a driver, then there's a destination. We can just as easily say there's a driver and a Toyota and a destination. The two are kind of, we can't say which one comes first. So this is what happens in dependent origination. Because of ignorance, because we don't know, we send the mind outwards in activity. When the mind acts or when the mind moves, it will immediately start to pick up a figure on the ground. Having that figure as the experience then, it activates the sense, the eye or the ear or whatever. Because that sense is activated, you have contact then with that figure, with that thing that you are experiencing. Because you are experiencing a thing, you have liking or disliking. When we say feeling, this is very, very specific, right? This is only, I should say pleasant or unpleasant. Some people don't like my translation, but I like it, so I'm sticking with it. You have liking or disliking of that thing. Because you like it or dislike it, you have craving. You want to get it, you want to get rid of it. Because of craving, you have, I put clinging, a better word is attachment. You have attachment to that thing. So for me, I'm in this room and I'm walking through this room. My organization is I don't want my robes to touch anyone because Thai tradition, you know, we're not supposed to have the robes touch people. I don't know what happens if the robes touch people, but... So my Gestalt action is I'm weaving my way through you and going for lunch. When I get to lunch and I sit down on the table, what I'm seeing is the chair. I get onto the chair and I stop. Then what happens? On the table, there is a jar of Marmite. There really was a jar of Marmite today. When I saw the Marmite, that's because my mind is moving out, right? My mind is acting and interacting with the world. Because my mind is interacting, I see the Gestalt, the thing that pops out of the table is the jar of Marmite. The rice I don't notice, the bread I don't notice, the yogurt I don't notice, the Marmite I notice. So this becomes my object. I cannot see Marmite without loving it, or hating it in your case. The two go together. So I have an experience or a figure on ground. The Marmite has popped up, everything else is in the background. And this activates, because the Marmite has popped up, my eye will get drawn into it. Once my eye is onto it, now I'm engaging with that object. I'm contacting with it. I like the word engaging instead of contact, but because of contacting, I'm liking it and like, oh my God, Marmite's, not even Vegemites, which I will take Vegemite, but Marmite's even better. Oh my God, I want this Marmite so much, clinging onto it. Now this means being, I'm going to call activity. Being or becoming, but bhava has a sense of acting. So for example, if I'm climbing a rock face, this is bhava. This means that I'm engaged in that activity. So according to the Buddha, he said, your consciousness here gets stationed here. Your consciousness gets stationed with your activity. Right? So while I'm eating, my consciousness is stationed with this activity of eating, even though the figure on ground may change, like a bit of marmite, bit of bread, bit of rice, bit of yogurt, bit of, oh, what's that? Okay, a bit of that. But, so I'm being stationed with this particular activity. And while I'm doing that, I'm not noticing who's looking through the window. Because I know what goes on. You look through the window and you say, what's Bante eating here? Like, I brought some cake today. Is he eating my cake or is he eating... Now, supposedly, because of our predilection, our tendency to always be acting and getting engaged in conscious activity, means that after we die, the mind will automatically go and get engaged in another lifetime. According to Buddhism, it's a bit complicated, but according to Buddhism, it's this tendency of us to always be looking to get engaged in activity that causes us, after we die, that somehow we look around and we find another rebirth. How that works, I can't tell you, but that's the teaching. And because you are born, you have old age, sickness, and death will come up. So that is the phenomenological interpretation of dependent origination. Okay? Yes. I thought I should get a clap for that. Okay, this is just one of the many models. I have it on my thesis here. The Buddha said nama is at one end, rupa is at the other end. Craving is the seamstress thing that pulls it all together. Another time he said nama rupa is at one end of like a stick. Consciousness is at the other end of the stick. And when this stick is whole, we have the sense of contacting or conscious engagement with something. I can show you the quotes, I have them, but then you have to switch the screen back to the computer. Okay.
I think the way you presented with the Gestalt thing and the people on the ground helps me to understand the dependent origination better, because when you say you go into the room and you see the marmite, well, I was saying,
No, it's on.
hello. Hello.
You need the magic hand, you see.
No, Bante, thank you very much for explaining using the gesture and the figure on the ground, because it helps me to understand dependent origination, whereby how the consciousness is being presented with something right in front of you, and then all things go into the background. Yeah. Because when I look at dependent origination, like you quote the examples that when you enter the room, you saw the marmite on the table. When I look at it previously, I thought your sixth sense would come into the play, because your eye will look at the object, and then your eye consciousness will come into the play. And that's where your contact with your marmite, and then your feeling that you like the marmite. So you are telling us that it actually occurs before that, whereby your consciousness is being pulled by the things around us. And I'm just trying to think whether these things around us is like what the Buddha says, that all phenomena are caused by cause and conditions. So these things around us are the cause and conditions that is pulling our mind, creating those experiences. Because like there are so many things in the room. Why did I see this particular thing? It's because of some cause and condition that pull me towards it.
Yeah. This cause and conditions, he didn't say cause and conditions, he said by dependent origination, which usually gets translated as by causes and conditions. So when we go into the dependent origination, we want to find where. The whole process is causes and conditions. But we want to find out where in there does the object arise. And there are other also valid interpretations of this teaching that would put the beginning of the object appearance at Salayatana. So one of the traditional ways to interpret this teaching is the first 4 links are the previous lifetime until you get born. Nama Rupa is when you go into the womb. And then after that, you get Salayatana, you get 6 senses. But it's very difficult to justify that. There's so many problems with that interpretation. Nowhere else in the scriptures does Vijnana mean the entering of a consciousness into a being. Also, that would mean that consciousness is something that moves around from life to life, which the Buddha said that is wrong, categorically. That's why this particular interpretation I find a lot better. This, if you know the different interpretations, you'll know there's a 3-lifetime model and there's an instantaneous model. And the instantaneous model says this entire chain happens in a moment. But when you look at the descriptions of it, it's very wishy-washy. Like the definitions of the terms, this actually comes from Ajahn Buddhadasa. There is a precursor to that appears in the Visuddhimagga, but it's also very wishy-washy and vague and confused because they can't say exactly what these terms are. Importantly, Vijnana consciousness, I've written as cognition, but they always translate as consciousness. But the English word consciousness means something that you have all the time. So in the morning you have weak consciousness, you have your coffee and it gets bigger, things come in and out of consciousness. But the English word consciousness is something that you have all day until maybe when you go to sleep, maybe you lose it then. But that's not the Buddhism sense. Vijnana means the consciousness of that object at this moment. When that object passes from your attention, that consciousness has died. The consciousness arises with the object and ceases with the object. And this is categorical throughout all of... You know the word categorical now, don't you? Whoever was at my logic class. Categorically, throughout all of Buddhism, that was how it was presented. Yeah. Anybody else have a question, a comment? Does this aid or hinder your understanding? Use the mic.
Monday, you said the 3 models. So the instantaneous model and the process model. What is the 3rd model?
Okay, 3 models. One is... the one model is this is past life. This is entering into the womb. And then this is being born. And then this is the next rebirth. Rebirth in the next life. So it goes over 3 lifetimes here, but 4 sections. Or 4 sections. The instantaneous model means that all of this from here to here happens in an instant. And that's much closer to what I've been presenting today. The problem with that instantaneous model is they have no clear definitions of the terms because they have no understanding of what Gestalt is. That's why I think that the teaching of Gestalt clarifies the teachings here, especially the fact that the Buddha said a nama-rupa the mental side cannot arise without a physical side, and the physical side cannot arise without a mental side. That is exactly what Gestalt means. Right? You cannot see the walrus, you cannot see Grumpy Cat and not see him as grumpy, because the mental thing arises with the physical thing. So the whole teaching on Gestalt and the nice pictures that you can see, and it's fairly easy to understand, right? It's not a complicated thing. If you know Gestalt, then this becomes very clear here. This is the arising of an object. This one, by the way, is very often missing from dependent origination, this term. It's not vital. So the instantaneous model is all of this appears in one go. The problem is jati means rebirth. And every definition in the sutta says, here I was reborn in this life, I did this for my work, I ate this kind of food. I like why they think about what kind of food they ate in a lifetime. I wore these kind of clothes, here I passed from this lifetime, from that lifetime, and I was born in this clan. And I wore this kind of food, I did this kind of livelihood. That's the description of how it is for jati. So to say that jati means rebirth in the moment doesn't make any sense, according to the original things. And the same for old age, sickness and death. It's difficult to say, I look at a pen and now I've got old age, sickness and death. Doesn't make much sense. So the instantaneous model has some real big problems. Although, as you can see, I'm probably more sympathetic to that than others. The best one is actually, I found in a book from Tibetan Buddhism, and it was a 2-lifetime model, and says, this all happens in an instant, but this is your next lifetime. And that I would agree with. However, that book also had no real, it got very confused with consciousness, it got very confused with Namarupa. Yeah. But for us, right, hopefully, it's quite easy. This is a figure, appears on the ground. Yeah.
Why did Buddha teach this now that we know so
Okay, so what? The point is that every moment of consciousness, every moment of experience from 500,000 lifetimes ago until the day you get enlightened, the only thing you will ever know is a figure appearing on the ground. And because figures appear on ground, you have this constant movement into feeling, craving, clinging. The mind is always flowing out. The Buddha said, we did this one a couple of days ago, avijja, ignorance means you make an action either of body, speech or mind. Putting aside any action or intentional action of body, speech and mind, none of this will arise. And that's the definition of enlightenment. So, according to Buddhism, this will always be going on until you know the vicca. And the vicca is the method. And if you know the method to apply the mind, then you get enlightened, and this process will never take hold again. Now, I can't say that, but when you do meditation, this actually isn't that difficult to experience. If you're mindful and you watch yourself moving around, you see your mind grab onto an object, get propelled, I like it, I don't like it, I want to get it, and then that's gone, and like, oh, this object, I like that, I don't like it, I get it, I got all this attachment, and then, oh, this object, I've got an itch in my ear, and then you see your consciousness going around, so this process is easily visible to someone who's mindful. You can also stop from a moment from any activity of the mind. This is when the mind comes together, becomes very bright, becomes very still, it becomes self-knowing, and you can see that from that point, you can see that whenever your mind moves out, this whole thing starts to crank up again. Whenever the mind stops still, it comes back together, and you're like, oh, that's right. So even though one isn't enlightened, you can start to know the mind other than doing something, other than when it's caught up in this continual motion. How does an arahant operate then, if he has no action of any kind? This is a big question in Buddhism, because we see the Buddha go around and teach people and make teachings and interact with people and like, you're wrong and you're right and you guys shouldn't do that, and he's set down all these rules. So it seems that he's making actions. So that's a big question in Buddhism. Yeah. It was solved in a very funny way, actually. If a Buddha isn't making any, if an arahant isn't making any action anymore, how come it is that he's making actions? We see him doing stuff, right? Him or her as an enlightened being. So the Pali had, I shouldn't do this, should I? I shouldn't joke around, but I'm not being irreverent, this is actually true. Any kind of action, the word for action usually is karma. But the Buddha's not making any action. So what he does in the commentaries, they called Kriya. And Kriya means action. But they said, you have a karma, but the Buddha has a Kriya. Problem solved. And it's true. That's how they solved the problem. I can't remember the terms now, but my friend Dr. George is a Tibetan Buddhist. He said that Tibetans came up with the exact same thing. They just invented a new term. Right, problem solved. We've got 6 minutes left, and then we're wrapping up for the day. I'll still be here, though, if you want to talk further, but we will be wrapping up. Anybody else have a question or a comment? Does what I presented help? Does it hinder? Are you just totally befuddled by it? Or did this part make sense and that part doesn't make sense? I mean, let me know.
Because I'm only at very rudimental level. When I hear the word dependent origination, I find it's whatever you said, it was all totally makes sense of our experience. But I thought it is a concept or that we cultivate to realize emptiness of an inherent dependence.
Okay.
And is my understanding right now totally convoluted right now?
No. If you're going to put it that way, you'll be in Nagarjuna's territory. And this is Nagarjuna, the great Indian philosopher, Buddhist philosopher. And he would present emptiness in that way. In Theravada Buddhism, emptiness is one of 3 higher practices. And they are higher practices because they're the last practices you do before you get enlightened. And they're practices that enlightened people maintain after they're enlightened. And those 3 practices are emptiness, signlessness, and desirelessness. And the Buddha said each of these 3 is different when you practice it, but the same when you attain to it. Now, I use the Signlessness Meditation. If you were here yesterday, or was it today? Okay, you got me doing so many things. The teaching given to Anuruddha, the Buddha's cousin, we see him about 6 times in the suttas, but the final time when he got enlightened, the Buddha said to him, focus on the signless. Now, a sign is the quality or feature of a thing. So again, it's a gestalt, it's a figure. The only way we know figure is by paying attention to the features of it. So he said, if you don't pay attention to the feature of anything, so the actual words were, when the eye is intact, the forms are there, and there's contact between them, eye consciousness arises. One does not pay attention to the signs and features of that form. Otherwise, unwholesome states may invade the mind. He abides restrained, not engaging in the signs and features of that form, and so on for the 6 senses. That's how it was actually put. So, emptiness actually still is a gestalt, still a form. It's one of the last meditation objects that you can use before enlightenment, one of the 3 higher forms. But in Nagarjuna, in Tibetan Buddhism, it's different. Emptiness is elevated to being a supreme enlightenment. It's different. I'm not an expert on Nagarjuna, though. Okay, one last thing before we go. Anybody have a feedback? Anybody totally confused? It was clear as mud, but we covered the ground. The confusion made my head spin round. I spent a lot of time on Gestalt and not very much time on dependent origination. And that might be one feedback. By the way, I've studied Gestalt for about 11 years now, so what I can present to you in an hour has naturally limited.
But they just a comment about karma. In the book of 4, there are 4 types of karma. So we talk about the Buddha and the Arhant's karma. Actually, it's in the 4th type, which is neither dark nor bright karma.
Yeah, you have dark and bright. Dark, not bright. Bright, not dark. Bright and dark, and neither bright nor dark. Okay, are we good? We all done? Okay, we finished on time. It's good. 2 minutes ahead of time, very Singaporean. Okay, thank you all for coming. I hope you enjoyed that. And if you have any questions, you're welcome to come up and ask me.
Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.